The dense forest stretched endlessly, its towering pines swaying gently under the golden glow of the setting sun. A cool breeze rustled the leaves, carrying the distant cries of unseen creatures. Somewhere within this vast wilderness, a little girl stood frozen, her breath shallow, her heart pounding. Emma was only 10 years old, but she was no stranger to the wild. Her father, a wildlife biologist, had taught her everything about the animals that roamed these lands. Yet, nothing had prepared her for this moment. She was alone, deep in the forest, and 12 pairs of eyes were locked onto her. 12 bobcats, their sleek bodies blending seamlessly with the underbrush, had surrounded her. Their yellow-green eyes flickered with curiosity, and perhaps something else. Emma swallowed hard. Running was not an option. Her mind raced back to her father's lessons. If you ever encounter a predator, don't act like prey. Stay calm. Stand your ground. But how could she stay calm? The bobcats were larger than she had imagined. Their muscular limbs and sharp claws made them look powerful, even graceful. Though they were not known to attack humans, they were still wild animals, unpredictable and potentially dangerous. Emma had strayed too far from the campsite. She had followed a trail of animal tracks, fascinated by the tiny imprints in the mud. She hadn't realized how deep she had wandered into the forest until the sunlight had begun to fade. Now, with no clear way back, she was trapped in the heart of the wilderness, and she was not alone. One of the bobcats took a cautious step forward, its ears twitching. Emma clenched her fists, her small frame trembling. What should I do? Her father's voice echoed in her mind again. Fear makes animals react. Stay in control. Slowly, she inhaled, forcing herself to steady her nerves. She softened her gaze, making sure not to look directly into their eyes. It was a sign of aggression. Instead, she carefully lowered herself onto the forest floor. The bobcat stopped. Emma's heart pounded. Were they confused? Curious? Would they leave her alone? She could hear their soft, deliberate breaths. The largest one, standing just a few feet away, let out a low growl, not threatening, but not welcoming either. Then, something unexpected happened. Instead of moving toward her, the bobcats sat down. One by one, their sleek bodies lowered into the grass, tails flicking gently behind them. It was as if they were mirroring her action. They weren't attacking. They were watching, waiting. Emma didn't move. She let the silence stretch between them, her mind racing through possibilities. Why weren't they leaving? And then she noticed that one of the bobcats was limping. A deep gash ran along its hind leg, blood staining its fur. Emma's breath caught in her throat. Was that why they had approached her? Had the injured bobcat drawn them together? Or had it been seeking her help? She glanced at the others. They remained still, their gazes unwavering. Emma's fingers curled into the damp earth. She had spent years watching her father treat injured wildlife. She had seen how animals, even the fiercest ones, sometimes recognize kindness. She slowly extended her hand toward the wounded bobcat. The other bobcat stiffened. A wave of tension filled the air. Emma could hear the pounding of her own heartbeat. If she made the wrong move, if they took her gesture as a threat, this could end badly. She held her breath as the injured bobcat sniffed the air. Then it took a step forward. The others didn't stop it. They only watched, as if waiting to see what would happen next. Emma kept her hand steady. She didn't flinch, didn't retreat. She let the bobcat come closer, its whiskers twitching as it studied her. And then it did something no one would have believed. The bobcat nudged its injured leg toward her. Emma's eyes widened. It was asking for help. Emma barely dared to breathe. The injured bobcat stood just inches away, its golden eyes locked onto hers. The other 11 bobcats remained motionless, their bodies tense, watching closely. The wounded bobcat nudged its leg forward again, as if offering it to her. Emma's heart pounded. Was this even possible? Could a wild animal recognize her as a helper rather than a threat? She hesitated for only a moment before slowly reaching into her jacket pocket. Her fingers brushed against the small first aid kit her father always made her carry. She had never imagined using it on a bobcat. Stay calm. Stay steady. She carefully unzipped the kit, her movements slow and deliberate. The soft sound made the bobcat's ears twitch, but none of them moved. They were waiting. Emma gently pulled out a small antiseptic wipe. The injured bobcat let out a low, uncertain growl. "It's okay," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the wind rustling through the trees. She knew animals reacted to tone more than words. She needed to sound calm, confident, and non-threatening. The bobcat's ears flicked back slightly, but it didn't retreat. Emma extended her hand, the antiseptic wipe hovering just above the wound. The cut was deep, likely from a fight or an accident in the forest. It needed cleaning, but the moment she touched it, the bobcat might react. A deep breath. Then gently, she pressed the wipe against the wound. The bobcat flinched hard. A sharp growl ripped through its throat. Emma braced herself. If it lashed out, there was nothing she could do to stop it. But then it didn't attack. The bobcat's muscles remained tense, but after a few seconds, it stayed still. Emma exhaled in relief and continued cleaning the wound, ignoring the way her fingers trembled slightly. The other bobcats inched closer, their tails flicking as they watched intently. They weren't hostile. They were curious. The injured bobcat let out a deep sigh, its body relaxing slightly under her touch. Emma had seen this before. Wild animals were never truly tame, but sometimes, when pain and fear were replaced with care, a strange kind of trust could form. She needed to bandage the wound next. She reached for the roll of gauze in her kit, tearing off a small piece. Slowly, she wrapped it around the bobcat's leg, securing it gently. The animal let out a soft huff, almost like a sign of acceptance. She finished tying the bandage and finally sat back, her breath heavy with disbelief. The bobcat inspected its leg, sniffing the white cloth. Then, to Emma's utter shock, it let out a soft, purring sound. Bobcats don't purr, do they? Emma's mind was racing, but before she could process what had just happened, she became aware of something else. The other bobcats had begun to move. Her stomach clenched as they closed in around her. She had been so focused on the injured one that she had forgotten the rest of the pack. Had she broken some unspoken rule? Had they only allowed this because of the wounded bobcat? Her fingers dug into the dirt as the largest bobcat, asterisk, asterisk, a massive one with a scar over its right eye, asterisk, asterisk, stepped forward. Its eyes, sharp and calculating, locked onto her like it was assessing her. Emma's instinct screamed at her to run, but she forced herself to stay still. Running was prey behavior. The leader bobcat circled her slowly, sniffing the air. Emma held her breath, feeling its powerful presence just inches away. Then suddenly it stopped. For several long seconds, everything was completely silent. Then in a slow, deliberate motion, the leader bobcat bowed its head slightly. Emma's heart skipped a beat. She didn't know much about bobcat behavior, but this felt like acknowledgement. A wave of understanding passed between them. The leader let out a low chuffing sound, and as if on command, the other bobcats also relaxed. Their tails lowered, their stiff posture softened. They were accepting her. Emma swallowed hard, still processing what had just happened. She had entered the forest as an intruder, a lost child, vulnerable and alone. But now, she was something else. She was no longer just an outsider. She had earned their trust. But what did that mean? And more importantly, what happened next? Emma sat frozen in place, surrounded by 12 wild bobcats. The tension that had once filled the air had shifted into something she couldn't quite explain. The injured bobcat rested beside her, its leg wrapped in the bandage she had carefully applied. The leader, the massive bobcat with the scarred eye, watched her in silence, its expression unreadable. The others sat in a loose circle, their sleek bodies blending into the forest shadows. Emma's heart still pounded, but it was no longer fear. It was something else. Trust. She had earned their acceptance. But now, a bigger question loomed in her mind. Why were they still here? Bobcats were solitary creatures. They didn't form packs like wolves. The fact that these 12 were together was already strange, but the way they stayed with her, watching, waiting, it didn't make sense. Something was wrong. Emma's sharp instincts, honed from years of exploring the wild with her father, told her that there was more to this than just an injured animal. She needed to think. Slowly, she turned her head, scanning the dense forest around them. The towering trees stretched high into the evening sky, their dark silhouettes casting long shadows across the forest floor. The air smelled of damp earth, pine, and something else. Something off. A sharp, musky scent drifted through the trees. Emma's breath hitched. She recognized that smell. Another predator was nearby. Her fingers dug into the damp soil as she listened. The forest had fallen into a strange silence. No birds chirped, no branches swayed. Everything was still. The bobcats knew it too. She could see in their alert postures, the way their ears twitched, their bodies tensed. They weren't just sticking around for her. They were waiting for something, preparing for something. Then a sound cut through the silence. A low, deep growl. Emma's blood ran cold. It wasn't coming from the bobcats. She turned her head toward the trees, every muscle in her body rigid with tension. The underbrush shifted. Leaves rustled. Then a massive shadow moved between the trees. A mountain lion. Emma's stomach twisted in terror. Mountain lions were apex predators. Unlike bobcats, they were powerful enough to take down prey far larger than themselves. They were stealth hunters, rarely seen, but when they attacked, it was sudden and brutal, and this one was watching her. Its golden eyes glowed in the dim light, locked onto Emma like she was a meal waiting to be claimed. Her breath came in short, shaky gasps. The mountain lion's muscles were coiled, ready to pounce. She couldn't outrun it. She couldn't fight it. A lump formed in her throat as she fought to stay still. She knew how predators worked. Movement triggered the attack. If she bolted, the chase would begin. The mountain lion took a slow, deliberate step forward, its powerful shoulders rippling under its golden coat. It was assessing her, deciding if she was worth the effort. Emma braced for the worst. Then a flash of movement. The scarred bobcat, the leader, let out a fierce snarl and stepped in front of Emma. The other bobcats followed. One by one, they rose from the ground, their ears flattened, their bodies tensed. The air vibrated with low, warning growls. They were forming a barrier, protecting her. Emma's throat tightened. They're not running. They weren't just warning the mountain lion. They were standing their ground. The mountain lion hesitated, its ears flicking back. It hadn't expected this. A single bobcat would have been no match, but 12 of them? Emma could see the calculations in its eyes. Then, the leader bobcat lunged forward, a blur of movement, a sharp, guttural snarl. The mountain lion recoiled, its tail lashing. The other bobcats hissed and growled, advancing in perfect unison. They moved like a single force, their bodies tense, their warning clear. Back off. The mountain lion's ears flattened. It bared its fangs, growling in frustration. Then it lunged forward. Emma's breath caught in her throat, but the scarred bobcat was faster. It met the mountain lion mid-strike, slashing its sharp claws across the larger predator's face. A furious yowl echoed through the forest. The other bobcats joined in, darting around the mountain lion, snapping and clawing. Their strategy was clear. They were forcing it back. The mountain lion swiped at them, but was outnumbered. For every attack, there were 3 counterattacks. The bobcats worked as one, their movement precise and relentless. Finally, the mountain lion let out an enraged, defeated snarl. It backed away, its golden eyes still burning with frustration. But it knew this was not a fight it could win. With one last flick of its tail, it turned and vanished into the trees. The tension in Emma's chest finally broke. It was over. The bobcats stood still, their ears perked, listening. After a few seconds, the leader let out a low, chuffing sound, and the others relaxed. Emma exhaled sharply, her hands trembling. They protected me. The realization hit her like a wave. Wild animals didn't do this. They didn't risk their own safety for a human. They didn't fight off a predator for someone like her. And yet, they had. She looked at the leader, her voice barely above a whisper. "Thank you." The scarred bobcat stared at her for a long moment. Then, in a slow, deliberate motion, it nudged its head against her arm. Emma's breath caught. It understands. 12 wild bobcats had surrounded her. She had feared for her life. But in the end, they hadn't been hunting her. They had saved her. But why? As the last rays of sunlight filtered through the trees, a new realization settled in Emma's mind. The bobcats had been waiting for something all along. And whatever it was, this wasn't over yet. Emma sat on the forest floor, her breath still uneven from the encounter with the mountain lion. The 12 bobcats surrounded her like silent guardians, their eyes sharp, their muscles still coiled with tension. The scarred leader, the one who had saved her, stood closest, its golden gaze locked onto hers. It had defended her, fought for her, and even trusted her. But why? Emma's mind raced. Bobcats weren't known for their loyalty. They weren't like dogs or wolves. They were wild, independent, solitary. And yet, here they were. She swallowed hard, forcing herself to focus. The danger had passed, but different unease settled in her gut. Something about this night wasn't right. The mountain lion's attack hadn't been normal. Emma had spent years learning about wildlife from her father. She knew how predators worked. Mountain lions avoided fights unless they were desperate. They only attacked humans if they were starving, sick, or threatened. But this one, it had been watching her before the attack, tracking her, like it had been waiting for the right moment. Her fingers tightened in the dirt. What if it wasn't just random? What if there's something else out here? A sudden rustling sound broke her thoughts. The bobcats turned their heads in unison, their ears twitching toward the dense trees ahead. Emma's breath caught. Something or someone was nearby. She strained to hear. The wind whistled through the branches. Leaves trembled. The scent of damp earth filled her nose. Then a distant metallic click. Her stomach dropped. That wasn't an animal. It was a sound she recognized. A rifle being cocked. Emma's pulse surged. Her father had taken her hunting before. She knew that sound far too well. Someone was in the forest, armed. She turned toward the bobcats. They were motionless, listening, their bodies lowered, tails flicking. They sensed it too. A cold realization settled over her. This was why they were acting strangely. They hadn't just been watching her. They had been protecting her from something else. Emma slowly pushed herself up, her knees shaking. The scarred bobcat's gaze flicked toward her, as if warning her to stay still. But she couldn't. She had to know. Taking a cautious step forward, she kept close to the bobcats. Their bodies moved with her, a silent wall of fur and muscle. Then a voice, low, rough, got movement over here. Emma's chest tightened. She barely dared to breathe. She wasn't alone. The voice was close. Too close. She pressed her back against a tree, peering through the dense foliage. The shadows shifted. Then 2 figures emerged from the trees. Hunters, dressed in dark clothing, rifles slung over their shoulders. They moved with purpose. Their boots crunched against the forest floor, their eyes scanning the trees. Emma's breath hitched. Poachers. She knew it instantly. These men weren't just hunters. They were here for something illegal, and she wasn't supposed to see them. The bobcats had known. That's why they had surrounded her. That's why they had refused to leave. They weren't just protecting her from the mountain lion. They were protecting her from these men. Emma's heartbeat thundered in her ears. She had to get out. Slowly. She crouched lower, pressing herself into the shadows. If she could just slip away without them noticing. A snap. A dry twig cracked beneath her foot. The men froze. Emma's blood turned to ice. One of them turned toward the sound, his hand moving to his rifle. "Did you hear that?" The other man nodded, his grip tightening on his weapon. "Yeah, we're not alone." Emma clenched her teeth. She had seconds to decide. Run or stay hidden. Then, before she could make a move, the scarred bobcat let out a low, guttural growl. Emma's eyes widened. The bobcat stepped forward, muscles tight, tail twitching. The other bobcats followed. 12 pairs of glowing eyes stared out from the darkness. The hunters stopped cold. One of them cursed under his breath. "What the hell?" The second man lifted his rifle. "It's a whole pack of them." Emma's stomach twisted. The men had guns. The bobcats were wild animals. If the poachers felt threatened, they would shoot. Her breath came fast and shallow. She had to do something. Before the men could react, she stood up. "Stop." The word burst from her lips before she could think. Both men snapped their heads toward her. She held up her hands, stepping out from behind the trees. The leader, tall, with a thick beard and cruel eyes, narrowed his gaze. "What the—" "Kid, what are you doing out here?" Emma swallowed hard. "I was hiking." The second man sneered. At this hour? Her pulse pounded. She had to think fast. "I got lost, but these bobcats found me." The men exchanged a glance. The leader scoffed. "Bobcats don't find people. They hunt, Em." Emma clenched her fists. "They're not hunting me." She took a slow breath. "They're protecting me." The men didn't laugh. They didn't even move. Instead, the leader's eyes flicked toward the bobcats, his jaw tightening. For the first time, he looked uneasy. Emma saw it. He was afraid. Not of her. Of them. The 12 bobcats hadn't moved an inch. They stood perfectly still, watching the men with piercing golden eyes. Their silence was louder than any growl. Then, the scarred bobcat took a step forward. The men backed up. Emma's heart leapt. They were hesitating. She seized the moment. "You should leave." Her voice was steady now. "If you shoot, they'll attack." The leader clenched his jaw. His fingers hovered over his gun. Then, the scarred bobcat growled. Deep, dangerous. The man flinched. Emma's pulse pounded. "Please work. Please just go." Finally, the leader exhaled sharply. "Not worth it." He turned. "Let's go." The second man hesitated. "But—" "Now." With one last glare, the men disappeared into the trees. Emma collapsed to her knees. Her entire body trembled. They were gone. She turned to the bobcats, her breath shaky. They had saved her again. She had no doubt now. They knew. These bobcats weren't just wild animals. They had been waiting for her, watching her, protecting her. But from what? As the last echoes of the poachers' footsteps faded, Emma realized one thing. This wasn't over. Not yet. Emma sat frozen in the clearing, her heartbeat thudding like a drum in her ears. The poachers had disappeared into the forest, but their presence still lingered in the air like a heavy shadow. The bobcats remained on high alert, their golden eyes fixated on the trees, ears twitching at every distant sound. They weren't relaxing, which could only mean one thing. The danger wasn't over. Emma's breath was shaky as she pushed herself up from the ground. She looked at the scarred bobcat, the leader, who had been standing closest to her. Its gaze met hers, and for a fleeting moment, she swore she saw something more in those eyes. Not just instinct, not just survival. It was intelligence, understanding. She swallowed hard, trying to piece together everything that had just happened. Why were the poachers here? Poachers didn't just venture deep into restricted forest lands without a reason. They were after something valuable, something worth the risk. Her mind was still racing when the scarred bobcat took a step forward. Then another. It turned its head slightly, looking back at her, waiting. Emma's stomach twisted. It wanted her to follow. She hesitated. Every logical part of her brain told her this was insane. She was already in deep trouble. stuck in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by wild animals. But something deep inside her whispered, "Trust them," taking a shaky breath. Emma took a step forward. The bobcats disappeared into the trees. Emma followed. They walked in near silence, the only sound being the rustling of leaves beneath their paws and feet. The deeper they went, the more eerie the forest became. The towering trees blocked out the last of the fading light, casting everything in a dim, ghostly glow. The air felt thicker, as if it carried a weight of something unseen. Then the scent hit her. Emma gagged, covered her nose. It was a strong, metallic stench, the acrid tang of blood. Her stomach twisted into knots. The bobcats led her to a small, secluded clearing, and that's when she saw it. The ground was stained dark. Scattered across the dirt were tufts of fur, claw marks dug deep into the earth, evidence of a violent struggle. Emma's breath caught in her throat. This wasn't just a random hunting site. It was a slaughter. Her eyes darted from one gruesome sign to another. The remnants of carcasses, broken bones, some fresh, others older. She could feel the horror seeping into her skin. How long had this been happening? She turned back to the bobcats, her heart pounding. This is what they were trying to show her. The poachers weren't after deer. They were hunting bobcats. Emma's pulse raced. She stumbled forward, her mind spinning. Why? Hunting bobcats was illegal in this area. It didn't make sense. Then a glint of metal caught her eye. She crouched down, brushing away some dirt. It was a collar. Her hands trembled as she picked it up. It wasn't a pet collar. It was thicker, reinforced metal with a tracking chip embedded inside. Emma's chest tightened. Bobcats didn't wear collars. Not unless... Her stomach lurched. This wasn't just a poaching site. This was a research site. Her eyes flickered over the remains, the broken fur patterns, the scattered tags. These bobcats had been part of the study. Scientists had been tracking them, studying them, and the poachers had been wiping them out. Emma's hands clenched into fists. This wasn't just about hunting. This was something bigger. She thought about the black market, the illegal fur trade, the demand for exotic animal parts. Her body tensed with anger. These bobcats had saved her twice, and now she understood why. They weren't just protecting themselves. They were fighting for survival. Emma stood up, gripping the collar. She had to stop this. But how? She reached into her pocket and pulled out her phone. No signal. Of course. They were too deep in the wilderness. She cursed under her breath. She had two options. 1, find higher ground and hope for a signal. 2, go back to where she last saw the poachers and get evidence. Both were risky, but she had no choice. She turned back to the bobcats. "I need to go," she whispered. "I need to find help." The scarred bobcat held her gaze. Then, to her shock, it stepped forward and nudged her hand with its head. Emma's breath hitched. It was the first time it had ever touched her. A silent message passed between them. They trusted her. Now, she had to prove they were right too. Emma swallowed hard and turned, and ran. Branches tore at her arms as she sprinted through the darkness. Her lungs burned, her legs screamed, but she didn't stop. Then, a light, up ahead, flickering between the trees. She slowed, pressing herself against a tree trunk. A camp. Emma's heart pounded. She could see the poachers now, standing near a crackling fire. There were 3 of them. One of them, the older man in a dark jacket, was speaking in a sharp tone. "Almost done here," one of the younger men muttered. "We'll get the last of M by sunrise." The older man nodded. "Good. No loose ends." Emma's blood ran cold. They weren't stopping. They planned to kill every last bobcat. Her fingers clenched around her phone. She might not have service, but she had something else, a recording feature. She pressed record. The men continued talking, unknowingly revealing their entire plan. Emma captured every word, every incriminating detail. Then She made her move. She grabbed a rock and threw it. Crack! The rock slammed into a tree. The men froze. Emma didn't wait. She bolted. Behind her, the poachers shouted, "Hey! Someone's here!" Footsteps thundered behind her. They were chasing her. She pushed herself harder, her lungs screaming for air. She had to get away. Then a shape burst in the trees. Emma skidded to a stop. Her breath caught. The Bobcats, all 12 of them, standing in the moonlight, blocking the poacher's path. The scarred Bobcat snarled. The others followed. A wall of fur, claws, and fury. The poachers stumbled back, panic flashing across their faces. What the... The scarred Bobcat lunged. The men screamed. Emma didn't wait to see what happened next. She turned and ran. She had the proof. Now, she had to make it out alive. Emma's lungs burned as she sprinted through the dark forest, her legs pounding against the damp earth. The wind howled in her ears, but she didn't stop. She couldn't stop. Behind her, the echoes of snarls and human screams filled the night. The Bobcats had intercepted the poachers, buying her precious time to escape. But she knew it wouldn't last forever. The poachers were armed, and if they made it out alive, they'd come after her next. Her fingers tightened around her phone. It was her only weapon. The evidence she had recorded was a key to stopping this nightmare. She just needed to find a way to send it. But first, she had to survive. Emma pushed forward, dodging low-hanging branches. Her mind raced, trying to piece together a plan. The main road was too far, and with no cell service, calling for help was impossible. She needed higher ground, somewhere she could get a signal. Then through the trees, she spotted something, a rocky hillside. Her heart leaped. If she could just climb to the top, she might get a signal. Gritting her teeth, she ran toward it. The ground was rough, littered with jagged stones and loose dirt. Emma's hands scraped against the rocks as she climbed, her muscles aching from exhaustion. She could hear the poachers behind her now, their footsteps pounding, their angry voices slicing through the night. Almost there, she glanced over her shoulder. Her blood turned cold. The poachers had broken free. She could see them now, crashing through the underbrush, their flashlights sweeping wildly across the terrain. And they weren't alone. The scarred Bobcat was still fighting, but it was outnumbered. A gunshot cracked through the night. Emma flinched, terror gripping her chest. She forced herself upward, desperate, praying that she was high enough. With one final push, she reached the top. Her hands trembled as she pulled out her phone. One bar. Her heart pounded. Come on, just send. She pressed send. The screen buffered. The voices of the poachers grew closer. Then, delivered. Emma's breath caught in her throat. She had done it. But now, she had to get out of here. She turned to climb back down, when suddenly she heard something, not human voices, not the rustling of leaves. Something louder. Engines. Her pulse spiked. Helicopters. Then, floodlights split the darkness. A booming voice rang out over a loudspeaker. Freeze! Hands in the air. Emma's legs nearly buckled. The authorities had arrived. The forest erupted into chaos. The poachers' faces twisted in panic as armed officers stormed into the clearing, their rifles raised. The leader, the older man in the dark jacket, tried to run. He didn't get far. The scarred Bobcat lunged, knocking him to the ground. He screamed as the officers surrounded him, pinning him down. The other two men raised their hands in surrender. It was over. Emma stood frozen, watching the scene unfold, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The Bobcats, every last one of them, stood at the edge of the trees, watching. They had won. Hours later, Emma sat on the back of an ambulance, a warm blanket wrapped around her shoulders. She was still processing everything. The authorities had been investigating the poaching ring for months, but they hadn't had enough evidence to take action. Until now, her recording had sealed the case. Every word, every confession, every crime was now on record. The men were going to prison. And the Bobcats? They were finally safe. Emma looked up at the scarred Bobcat, standing a few feet away. Their eyes met. For the first time, Emma saw something different in its gaze. Not just intelligence, not just survival, but recognition, gratitude. Emma swallowed the lump in her throat. "Thank you," she whispered. The Bobcat didn't move. Then, slowly, it dipped its head, a gesture of respect. Emma felt tears sting her eyes. She had come into the forest alone. She was leaving with something more. A bond, a connection that would never be broken. She watched as the Bobcats turned, one by one, and disappeared into the wilderness. Their home, and for the first time in a long time, it was safe. Epilogue: a new mission. Days later, Emma's story went viral. News stations covered it. Wildlife organizations praised her courage. She received calls from conservation groups, researchers, and even law enforcement. They wanted to know more. They wanted her help. Emma realized something. This wasn't the end of her journey. It was just the beginning. She had seen the truth. Now, she would fight to protect it, no matter what.